Thank you all so much for coming and spending this evening with us. I'm Dr. Senya Nouriel. As Esther said, I was the gallery director and curator here, and now I'm the assistant director of the international program at the Museum of Modern Art. I would be remiss to not be here this evening to celebrate really an essential foundational period of this institution in and around the time of its creation. Next slide. So the Art Students League of New York is celebrating its 150th year this year. Next slide. Next slide, please. The league was founded on June 2nd, 1875, not in this building, but it was founded by artists for artists in the atelier style of teaching, which we still teach. I'll keep saying we because once you're a leaguer, you're always a leaguer, which is still taught to this day, right here in and around the classroom, the room you're sitting in. Next slide, please. And as you can see, the league's building doesn't look too different than it did back in 1892, and that's indeed when this building opened. So a few decades after its founding in 1892, this building, designed by the architect Hardenberg, opened here on 57th Street. And in the intervening years, next slide please, the league has been home to countless, dozens, hundreds, thousands of artists, many of whose work you see here, some of whom may or may not be discussed today as they are turn-of-the-century artists. Next slide. And it's still a vibrant cultural outlet for New York City and the world. And here you see some of our current instructors, current students, both in the classroom and also in the sphere of public art. Next slide, please. And so we are so honored to have these three distinguished guests with us tonight to kick off our 150th year, which will be celebrated in so many ways, starting very much with this very important public program, inclusive of a publication coming out later this year. And next slide. Many, many more activities. So we do encourage you all to stay in touch with the league, to check our website, and to join us for this very important celebration of art and art making. Next slide. So you're in the gallery of the Art Students League today. As you can see, this is what it looks like. This was not always a gallery. This, in fact, began as a members' lounge. Next slide, please. And so it's very interesting that the identity of the League's gallery, so critical to its core and to its operation, has in fact changed location, whereas our studios have remained relatively unchanged. Here you see a historic image from St. Gaudens's sculpting class on the left and a contemporary image of our sculpture studios today. Next slide. Similarly, our painting and drawing studios, historically on the left, today on the right. Next slide. And so this comes to the point of our talk tonight. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the Vanderbilt Whitney family, broadly conceived, founded the first gallery here at the Art Students League, which was originally on the first floor of the building in studios 15 and 16, for those leaguers out there who may or may not know. And that space was very, very, very special. You can see it here. You can see it's marked by these gorgeous stained glass windows on its roof, giving natural light into the space, these archways and porticos. And then please pay attention to those benches. They'll come up in other pictures in a few moments. And so going back to 1891, next slide, please. That's when George Washington Vanderbilt II, an avid art collector, loaned the Art Students League $100,000 in exchange for this portion of land on which this gallery was built. And it was a spectacular gallery. It opened with the building in 1892, and eventually George Washington Vanderbilt II was very generous and told the League it didn't have to repay its loan. And so truly on the generosity of the Vanderbilt family, the League did found its first gallery, and it became home to a number of landmark exhibitions. Next slide, please. Here you see more views of the gallery. Next slide, please. some additional views of that gallery and its adjacent galleries. So adjacent to the Vanderbilt Whitney Gallery, as it eventually was called, there were smaller galleries, all of which now are studios on the first floor of the building. Next slide. And you could even see in some historic photos works from the League's permanent collection. This Hermes sculpture, gifted by Andrew Carnegie himself, still part of the League's permanent collection, on view in the Vanderbilt Gallery. Next slide. And so I leave you with this, and I leave you to keep this in mind, how alive this history is here at the League. In fact, these benches still stand in our lobby today. So while the grandeur of this gallery is no longer extant, or at this time here at the League, we still have vestiges of it. And it resonates the living history that is true to the core of the League. And so it is such an honor, and I now turn to our distinguished speakers to share their expertise, their thoughts in and around the Vanderbilt Whitney family, some of which, indeed is very close to their heart.
So what was the last thing on Americans' minds when they first settled in the United States? Art. Absolutely no interest whatsoever.
She's a great speaker.
If you went to a well-to-do person's house, and well-to-do was a pretty modest word until after the Civil War. If you went to one of their houses, what might you see if there was anything on the wall at all? Either an ancestor portrait or Revolutionary War figures history painting. There wasn't much else. That was just not a priority. Who changed it? This funny guy. Next. Esther, thank you. Okay, this is Samuel Ward, who built what was the showiest house in New York City by 1830. It was a red brick house designed by a very good architecture firm for the day, Town and Davis. It was a really spectacular house, and in it he had, as you can see on the back of the image there, he had an art gallery. And he is thought to be the first person to have an art gallery in New York City. What did he have in the art gallery? Not too much, even though he was wise enough to have married an Astor daughter, so there was money for a while, so he could have bought what he wanted, but that was a little too early for us. 1830s too early. Next, Esther, thank you. Okay, where could people who were beginning to show some interest in architecture and in painting and in photography, like Matthew Brady, where could they find a space to do their work? There was no place. Well, there was a new school. Some people here are graduates of that school. It was known as the University of the City of New York. It began with 60 whole dollars, and it was desperate for money and had no students. So what they did was rent out the rooms. So the rooms were rented out as studio space to Matthew Brady, to architects, to painters. On the roof was actually the site for Samuel F.E. Morse's portrait of his daughter that's up at the Met. He did it on the roof of this building. So we begin to see a little bit of studio space. There was at this time one place where artists did hang out, and this is the National Academy of Art, which is quite different from the studio topic we're going through today. They began as kind of loosely arranged place for people who knew nothing about how to paint and the materials you needed for painting, etc. And so people who were coming to have a full career in the arts might have gone to the National Academy of Art, which had this spectacular P.B. White building on 4th Avenue, one of the great high Victorian Gothic buildings of New York, which lasted, by New York standards, quite a long time. I think it stood for about 50 years. But that is also long gone. Next. The place that really did bring the idea of studio and art forward was this building by Richard Morris Hunt, 1857. It was on 10th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues, and it was the New York Studio Building, and it was a very brilliant building because it was charitable to begin with. One of the Johnston brothers, James Boorman Johnston, paid for it, so it was paid for by a benefactor who lived around the corner, who lived on the row at Washington Square, and he paid for this building. And the building had artist studio spaces, but more important, in the middle, this. A gallery space where artists could meet buyers and where on Saturday afternoon, well-to-do, beginning to be well-off New Yorkers could come in and buy works of art by American artists. Next. These pictures are a little pixelated, but Paul Mateyunas did a wonderful job making them look better. The big square in the middle is the space where you would show your works of art. And this was really quite wonderful because American artists, art was kind of new, kind of iffy, but everybody else wanted French nothing paintings. Most of the people who were buying art at this point to put on the walls, because now, thanks to our friend here, Sam Ward, we know we have to put art on the walls, but we don't know what we're doing. So we bought a lot of copies and a lot of French minor stuff, nothing serious. So what we have here is the attempt to show American artists are worthy of some consideration as well. And what we see here are some of the artists' studios. A couple of artists flipped around into many studio spaces, most notably William Merritt Chase, who some of you may know even had a little art colony out in Southampton. This is one of his studio spaces. What were studio spaces? They were a place where you could put together all the things artists needed. So your supplies, but you also had to have drapery, you had to have a Turkish rug, you had to have some poor animal flattened by a beast. So you had to have antique things, maybe even some North African things, because people were beginning to travel to that part of the world. So you had all these props, and this is where clients might come to either see your work if you didn't show it in the central gallery, or maybe to commission you to paint them, which we're going to see next. There we go. So here we see a person. This is Chase again. There's the flattened animal. And what we're seeing is an artist painting a picture of somebody, which is going to become, society painting is going to become a big thing with Chase and other painters by the second half of the 19th century, when New Yorkers began to, and when Americans began to have money. Next. Here's another one. I like the dog. Augustus St. Gaudens, who you've already mentioned, who did teach here, who I still believe was the greatest sculptor in America ever, but that's probably just me. But he had an Afghan hound that he kept as a prop for painting. So you've got to have some sort of big glamorous dog. This is not we had trouble figuring out whose studios some of these pictures. There are very few. The pictures of this time period and of this phenomenon are almost non-existent. Esther? Okay, here we go again. Here they are looking at the central space. The famous example is when Frederick Church paints Heart of the Andes, now a big spectacular painting in a big setting at the Metropolitan Museum. But here he is showing it off to potential clients. And so some people did buy American art. Okay. We also began to have a coterie of people who were artists. And they did funny things. Drank too much, smoked cigars, hung out, and had parties together. And here you see a group of these artists who become firm friends, and they have another studio to go to. They go to this one. This is another benefactor from around the corner. This building, although badly abused by my home institution, which has ruined it at the moment, but this is the Tuckerman Studio Building, just a little bit later than the John Boorman Johnston building, and it was artist studio spaces. And you may be looking at that picture and wonder why the building next door to it, which is a loft building for the fashion industry, which has moved in there, I thought artists needed north light. Well, when the building was built, there was no building just beside it. It was north light. It was over the Dutch church. So there was plenty of natural light for the artists who were there. And they had a lot of artists. That's where all those parties were. They had Alfred Pinkham Ryder, Winslow Homer. Everybody who wasn't nailed down took space in that. Later, NYU bought it, 1925, turned it. It's on Washington Square East. Extant. It is the only one of these buildings that is extant. In fact, they tore down the 10th Street studio in 1957. Is a national crime. It never should have gone. Okay, next. All right, the Johnstons were very interested in the arts. John Boorman Johnston, who built the studio building, had a brother, John Taylor Johnston, and here he is, who was one of the founders, in fact, I think it is the founder of the Metropolitan Museum. He had that house on the right. He moved just a block away from his parents and his family to 8th Street and 5th Avenue, and he had a stable at the back of his building. Now, Paul found this slide. I have never seen it before. We know he had a stable, but remarkably enough, in his maturity, when he did pretty well with the New Jersey Central Rail, which would take him down again, but when he was doing pretty well, he turned the stable into an art gallery. And he may have had the first, he and A.T. Stewart, who I'll show you in a minute, had the first major collections. They bought well, they bought sophisticated. He had at Turner, he bought Winslow Homer, he bought American paintings. He really had good works of art. He lost most of them when the economy failed in the 1870s, but he did regain them again, enough to have some suitable paintings in there when he died in the house in the 1890s. Okay, all right, so how are you going to get people to buy art when they don't know or care about it? Well, in 1847, one of New York City's first clubs, men's clubs, of course, was founded. This is a Century Association up now on 43rd Street. It was not there then. And the point of the Century was to meet artists and lawyers, to meet artists and businessmen, to introduce the people who make the art to the people who buy the art. And so what you have here is a club for well-to-do people, but if you donated a work of art, as your mother did, to the club, that's an instant entry. So it is still functional, as you know. Stanford White built a building. I made a point of the original building with its open loggia here, a wonderful building on what had been a stable block, and stables are the next part of the story. Okay, next, Esther, thank you. Oh, I got to go through the Esters. So here we see two very well people, kind of at the top of the financial picture, about 1868 or so, just after the Civil War. On the left screen is Mrs. Astor's house. Across the street is A.T. Stewart's house. Old money, pretension, social importance. Across the street, new money, aggressive. He didn't even survive a day in the General Grant cabinet because he had too many shady corners. That's Mrs. Astor at the top. And now let's take a look at the back of her building. She had an art gallery, and there it is. And what did Mrs. Astor buy? About the same thing August Belmont bought, about the same thing Sam Ward bought. Nothing to know anything about at all. No notable pictures. This is the room, however, which was stripped of the pictures in January every winter when she would have her famous ball where 400 people, you all know the rest of the story. But across the street was that merchant who was a little bit shady and did a lot of real estate. Next. And that is A.T. Stewart. There he is. That's the house. Mrs. Astor used to say, I may buy my carpets from the Stewart store down on Chambers Street, but I will never invite him to walk on them. However, we go in, next slide, there we go. Stewart in his rather overdone entranceway, but on the right, it's his picture gallery and his sculpture gallery, and he was really the first great collector in New York City. He really bought well. He bought European painting and he bought American painting. And he bought statuary by Hiram Powers. This is a great collection. He was a great connoisseur of art. Again, how, why? Nobody had to suffer through Art History 101. He just happened to have a good eye. And he bought very well. Luckily for us, when his widow died in 1886, most of that stuff was bought and given to the Metropolitan Museum, where it is among the best Meissoniers, one of my favorites, the Joan of Arc. So a lot of really good stuff. Okay, this is Charles T. Barney, who built a house that nobody has a picture of on 55th Street. And here he's dressed up for costume parties, were kind of the thing to do at this time. So here he is all dressed up for an endless costume party. We don't have a picture of his house, but we know he did, and this is something that goes back to the stable idea. The 55th Street block, 18th Street, 43rd Street, running west of 5th Avenue, were the stable blocks. That's where they had a lot of group stables and private stables. And Barney and a few of the other people who would make a lot of money in the late 19th century began to build their own little stable for their own horses, etc. Somebody came to Barney and said, the top of the stables, nobody needs it. It's empty. Why don't you let artists work in it? And so C.T. Barney began on West 55th Street the idea of artists at the top of his stables. And they were so successful doing it, and he got so many praising words for doing so. He built another run of them on the south side of the street, also as artists' studios. Happily, the last one was standing until 2019, and it has built the dust too. Okay, but it was a nice idea. Okay, up here, here's the house. So this is William Henry Vanderbilt in his double house, which you will know only too well. He bought a lot of art in 1880 in 1 year, a lot of it. Not much worth knowing. It's like Mrs. Astor and the rest of them. Only so far do we have anybody stand out, and that's John Taylor Johnston and A.T. Stewart. Next. Okay, St. Gaudens, he was sort of friends with everybody. Hard to believe, a rough and tumble person, a difficult person to some degree. He taught here. He had attachments to other places within the arts. But as you all know, he was the sculptor of events, people, and in this case, next, Esther, thank you, the wonderful Boston Brigade that's fought in the Civil War so nobly. St. Gaudens was a real figure in this world and in this time. This is the Shaw Monument, and it's really terrific. And I think that's about it. Hold on. What we didn't have much of, at this time were dealers, but they're beginning to come in. The place where dealers in the arts first came to in New York, no, make yourself be on one topic. 18th Street and 5th. There were a series of French dealers and then Duvines, and then they begin to come in. And this is Goupil Gallery, so we're beginning to see places where old master arts, the real thing, not the fake ones that were in Mrs. Astor's house, the real thing can be bought for a big price. And this is the period of the great art dealers in New York. I think that's it. Oh, this is the last of the Barney Studio buildings. This is the Holbein Studio, which stood, as I said, for quite a long time, but bit the dust 6 years ago. Thank you all.
Now, New York's Fifth Avenue started to move to the country, if you hit the next slide. Long Island, especially the North Shore of Long Island, less than 20 miles from Manhattan, had the great Hempstead Plains, the deep protected harbors, if you hit the next slide. It really remained mostly rural farmland for the earlier first half and into the early second half of the 19th century. They were going up to Newport, other places by boat and railroad. Long Island really, go back to that one. Oh, there we go. Remained relatively untouched farmland. These are some Quaker farmhouses in Old Westbury, and then two little seaport villages along the North Shore, if you hit the next slide. As the Industrial Revolution and Americans prospered, houses started to pop up along the North Shore. Upper right, that house was built for the Bryces, and that is in Roslyn, designed by Ogden Codman. And the two lower houses, the E.D. Morgan House, distant relation to J.P. Morgan, and then the Winthrop House, first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Winthrop family there, both located at Old Westbury. Next slide. What brought them here to the north, or not here, what brought them to the North Shore of Long Island was, again, the activities that you could have here. You had the Hempstead Plains for polo, you could see lower middle, and the Meadowbrook Club upper or left slide. And you had fox hunting, you had the rolling hills along the North Shore of Long Island, and then you also had things for carriages. That is Ambrose Clark of the Singer Sewing Machine, Fortune in front of his house, Broad Hollow in Old Westbury, now part of SUNY Old Westbury, the property, if you hit the next slide. Deep protected harbors also brought them out to Long Island. Here you could see the New York Yacht Club designed by Warren and Wetmore. It had a landing station in Glen Cove. Wonderful piece, comic in the left side of the slide. That is about 1930 Vogue magazine. Traffic problems even back then. This is called Traffic Jam at the New York Yacht Club when people were commuting in. The next slide. Lots of events and parties going on, weddings. Harbor Hill, the Clarence Mackey House, with Sunday school races after church. The daughter, Clarence Mackey's daughter with the ribbon around her waist, would marry Irving Berlin. Party on the lawn at Harbor Hill, and then a water garden party in Oyster Bay Cove at the Shonard Estate, if you hit the next slide. When did Long Island really start booming? The North Shore of Long Island really came into its own with the invention of the motor car. And here you could see one of the largest and most enthusiastic motorists, Willie K. Vanderbilt, with his sister Consuelo Vanderbilt, the Duchess of Marlborough. He actually, this is the construction of the Vanderbilt Motor Parkway, one of the first private toll roads, and that is really what brought people out to the North Shore of Long Island. So you had Northern Boulevard, you had the Vanderbilt Motor Parkway and Jericho Turnpike, the three main arteries bringing families. Families like William Collins Whitney actually built his own highway/road leading from the Jericho Turnpike area up to get to his property. If you hit the next slide. So building was booming. This is the George S. Brewster estate designed by Trowbridge and Livingston in 1914. Going up, actually went up, normally it would take about 2 or 3 years to build a house. This house, 40,000 square feet, went up in about 9 months to a year and a half with horses, not with mechanical equipment. If you hit the next slide. To go along with these grand houses, modern interpretations of their European counterparts, local Quakers started their own businesses. The Valentines and the Hicks actually got into the business of moving large-scale trees to be balanced out with the large-scale homes. Upper left is one of the homes of it's the home of Herbert Pratt, one of the Pratt homes in Glen Cove. Upper right, a Marshall Fields house in Lloyd Harbor, now part of Cumsett State Park. And then you have some evergreen gardens at the Grace Estate in Old Westbury, all in advertisements for Hicks, which is still in business in Old Westbury. If you hit the next slide. So building was booming, and soon there were over 1,200 houses lining the North Shore of Long Island, this being the second largest in the country. The largest on Long Island, 126-room house. This photograph, interestingly enough, was found up in the 4th floor ducts when they were restoring the house in the 1980s. And you can see the wonderful gardens laid out by both Olmsted, Beatrice Ferran, one of the first female landscape architects in the U.S., and Olmsted, Beatrice Ferran, and Dillon and Aldrich, who designed the house. If you hit the next slide. This is the man who built that house. This is Otto Kahn, a German financier and banker, big supporter of the arts, was one of the main people in charge of moving the Met up to its current location. You can see some of the many, many pieces in his second largest house in the country. And here you can see it being built. It had its own private golf course on the estate, 126 rooms. It's now restored, and you can actually go there and stay there as a hotel. It also has large weddings and different things, but it went from ruin to fully restored. If you hit the next slide. Another interesting gentleman of Town and Country, you have the estate of C.K. Billings, which is now Fort Tryon Park. Some of you might recognize the Billings Terrace. That was called the Billings Terrace because it was his estate. He sold the property to the Rockefellers, and they would build the cloisters. He was most prominently known in the Gilded Age for his dinner party, which was at the ballroom, or the ballroom, Mosette, at Sherry's, or one of the main salons, right?
I'm trying to remember. I knew once.
It was in one of the rooms at Sherry's, but he came up with a brilliant idea, a big equestrian, to bring horses in. And so he had the backdrop painted, he had turf brought in, he had special feed bags made to hold champagne buckets. It was apparently an amazing party, but the only thing they didn't count on was the smell from the horses. They didn't have a way to really ventilate it. So as New York City moved up, uptown, he moved off of the city and ended up buying on Long Island, and you can see his house Farnsworth there, and sadly the main house is pulled down. The garages remain, as well as part of the stable and one other, the original gate posts. If you get the next slide. Another big collector in both New York and Long Island. This man's father discovered a little silver mine called the Comstock Lode. And so he was considered one of the Silver Kings, had a significant amount of money, built a large 500-plus acre parcel in Roslyn, and commissioned Stanford White to build about a 60,000 square foot house with gardens by Jacques Robert. You can see his small polo stable in the left, his dairy barn in the middle, and his indoor tennis house designed by Warren Wetmore. If you hit the next slide. He had a very large collection. He spent well, did not necessarily invest well, and by the 1940s, a good portion of his fortune was lost. His armor collection, which you can see in that painting below and in the picture in the center, was sent to the Met, and the statues, the horse tamer, and the gate lodge are basically all that remain of the main house, except for a few small outbuildings. And the gatehouse is actually currently being restored by the Roslyn Landmark Society. If you hit the next slide. Two very interesting artists who also had a great house on Long Island. Robert Sewell and his wife Amanda Brewster Sewell had built a house in 1907 by A. Durham Wheeler. It was a very beautiful Tudor house, filled with their paintings, art. He was both a sculptor and a painter. Many of the pieces remained in the house until about 8 years ago. He even designed carved those wonderful wooden brackets with the dogs and the gargoyles and things. And her work below, his work on the upper right of the slide. If you get the next slide. That house, sadly, was renovated by a gentleman, and we don't really know what the inside looks like anymore. And he's actually now, I think, in jail for trying to kill someone. He hired someone. John in the back might know more of that story if you talked to him at the cocktail. Nothing to do with it. Another interesting house, this is a piece I owned by Eric Sloan, who was also involved here with the League. And this was a wonderful little invitation map whenever you were invited to a party at the Crisp house. Mrs. Crisp was in Otley, and Otley's had a department store. They lived in Glen Cove, but they had this wonderful expanded gentrified farmhouse by Chester Patterson. Still exists in Upper Brookville, right on Northern Boulevard, but a wonderful Eric Sloan drawing of that. If you hit the next slide. One of our probably most prominent artists, this is Louis Comfort Tiffany. You can see his townhouse here, which was up on 72nd Street, pulled down, and his wonderful house, Laurelton Hall, which was in Laurel Hollow. He bought the grounds of the Laurelton Hotel, tore it down, and built a large house. It was sort of his lifelong project. He did not have an architect. He actually would design different rooms himself, and then have someone turn it into working drawings. So the house was always changing and expanding. You could see the wonderful 2-story atrium there in the middle with that wonderful glass vessel, and that stands about 6 feet tall. That was on exhibit at the Met recently and is now back down at the Morse Museum. And that smokestack there, that minaret tower in the garden is actually a smokestack hiding his own private power plant. It's a very large compound. If you hit the next slide. Sadly, the house was vandalized and burned down in the 60s, but right before everything went south with that property, the Morse family came in and purchased it and took all the pieces, moved them down to Winter Park, Florida, if you're ever down there. The Morse Museum in Winter Park owns and actually has recreated numerous rooms, and then the entrance facade, which you can see up there, is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art on loan from the Morse, as well as the view of Oyster Bay window. If you hit the next slide. Another great New York collector, this is Henry Clay Frick. He would build his house by career in Hastings in New York. He would then in 1917 buy a country house, which was the Ogden Common House for Bryce. There's some rare photographs that were given to me by one of the butler's children a couple of years ago. That property is now the Nassau County Museum of Fine Art and has an exhibition with actually a League artist who has a painting, and you're going to see his slide coming up soon. If you hit the next slide. Another major collector, J.P. Morgan, would eventually create the Morgan Library. He was a big Long Islander, had his own private island with his house by Christopher Lafarge. Here you can see it called Mateyunas Point, sitting at the end of Long Island, and his yacht, the Corsair. He would actually commute with the New York Yacht Club into New York. If you hit the next slide. Here you have Marjorie Merriweather Post, another interesting collector, inherited a large fortune from the Post cereal, and then bought a little company called Birdseye and created Birdseye frozen vegetables. And so made even more money. The bottom left here, you see a picture of her at her house, Hillwood, which is in the upper right. That's her daughter on her lap, Dina Merrill, the famous actress. And interestingly, that slide, that picture of her, if you look at it carefully, there's something really interesting about it. If you go off of her biography, this picture was taken 3 years before she was born. When I was writing my second book, I put this in, I wanted to figure out how old she was, and I kept saying, well, wait a minute. No, 3 years before she was born. So she actually successfully changed her birth date by 3 years. Her yacht, the Sea Cloud, which also had a great collection in it. And then when her husband was U.S. Ambassador to Russia, she was one of the few Americans to go over. She took her yacht over and actually got to go through the Hermitage archives and actually buy different pieces, which would then be moved to her home in Washington, D.C., also called Hillwood, down below. If you get the next slide. Another great Long Island artist and collector family. You had Charles Curry Rumsey in the upper left. He went to school with a young man named Averill Harriman. He was teaching Averill Harriman polo, and when he did, he caught the eye of Mary Harriman, Averill's sister. And so they were married, and she was a great collector. He was a prominent sculptor. Sadly, his life was cut short in a car accident in Westbury near the train trestle on Post Avenue. He did the buffalo frieze over the Manhattan Bridge, the pagan statue that was at MoMA in the garden, and then that's their house by Burrow Hoffman up above. They would then sell that house, or they would actually they had that house. They started to build the one below, which is one of the last homes by McKim, Mead, and White after White died. The drawings were apparently done earlier, and then it was completed after his death. The Mary Herman Rumsey had that, and then the next Mary, every Rumsey married a Mary, and so there's 3 generations of Mary. So up until the last Mary in the early 2000s, that house remained in the family's hands. Really amazing piece. The son, or the grandson of the original Mary, was going through a storage unit in Pennsylvania. I don't know if I'm supposed to tell this story or if it was just a private story, but I will. You just don't tell anyone. Anyway, that Brancusi egg up there of the Sleeping Muse was found in a storage unit in Pennsylvania in the 90s. And it sat in that storage unit until one of the Rumsey kids found it. He was always scavenging around looking for different things, and he found this, couldn't get it authenticated. It sat around in the Brown Brothers Harriman offices for years on the desk of one of the men there. I actually spoke to him about it too. And then he finally found the paperwork, and it sold for, I think, $9 million afterwards. But other than that, it was worth nothing. He tried to, well, I won't tell that story. That one I won't tell. Next slide. This is the artist who is now on exhibition, and that's one of the lead paintings on the far right, the girl in the yellow dress there. This is F. Edwin Church, and he called himself F. Edwin Church to not be confused with the other Frederick Church. But he and his brother made a little bit of money in baking soda, and they had a large fortune, and he built this house in Locust Valley on Shoe Swamp Road, which is still privately owned. If any of you would like to see it, actually, Preservation Long Island is having their annual summer gala at that house, so you'll get to be able to tour it if you like. But he was a sculptor and a painter, did a lot of wonderful works. There's a picture of him at the League, actually. I think it says he's, second from the left in that picture. And he even did some sculpture, which is also on exhibition, a few of the pieces. And then there'll be another exhibition and lecture on Long Island about his work. One of the wives of one of the grandchildren is actually putting a whole catalog resonate together. If you hit the next slide. Interesting house by C.P.H. Gilbert, built for a lawyer named William Guthrie. He actually had this house built called Meudon. He wanted to create this wonderful water view, if you can see in the lower left. And there was one thing in its way, and that was the village of Laddingtown. So he actually, with his neighbor, Mr. John Aldred, together they bought the 60 homes in 60 homes in storefronts that made up the town, raised the entire village to create their water view. His granddaughter, Marion Willard Johnson, was actually one of the first female contemporary art dealers and modern art dealers, had the Willard Gallery in New York, and she actually had on the grounds of her grandparents' house that house designed by Jose Cert up above, and it's actually meant to look like a piece of sculpture. The base is actually the original stone ice house of the estate circa 1900, and Cert designed this modern box to sit up above it. It's still owned by the family and prized. And actually, interestingly enough, the barn and stable building, which is lower right, which is now the Armstrong Dairy, you can get eggs there. You just leave money in the refrigerator that sits out on the little front lawn there, and the chickens run around. It's kind of cool. But interestingly, during World War II, Mrs. Johnson invited all artists from Europe to come over and sort of be refugees a little bit there. And so Calder, Brancusi, Miro were all hanging out and working sometimes in these barns with the generous thanks of the grandparents, the Guthries. If you hit the next slide. This is the home, and actually, it's funny, one of the photos disappeared, but the upper gentleman built this house. That was Isaac Guggenheim, and Isaac Guggenheim would build Villa Corolla, designed by H. Buren McGonigal, one of the first American architects to receive a doctorate in architecture. His wife, Edith Marion Day, was actually a famous muralist, and she did several murals for this house. It was best known for its second owner after he died about 10 years after it was built, Isaac, and his brother, Solomon Guggenheim, got the property. Solomon did another renovation with McGonigal. You can see the wonderful terracotta work. There were beautiful murals in the house, again, by Edith Day and others. I was an advisor when this was sold to the Village from IBM. It was IBM Country Club for many years, and then when their stock plummeted in the mid-90s, it was sold to the Village. And so obviously Solomon would build the Guggenheim Museum, and then interestingly the picture of their music room, living room, and if you look on the left, you'll see that screen down below, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. If you hit the next slide. Interesting multi-generation here. This house in the upper left called Templeton, originally built for the DuPont family. Alfred I. DuPont, his wife died. He didn't really move in. It cost about $1.1 million to build in 1917. He put it up for auction and sold it to Frederick Guest for about $110,000 a couple of years later. And then it was owned by Winston Guest and his wife Cece Guest, seen here. And on different weekends, you could see Truman Capote or Salvador Dali or someone running around the pool for the famous different parties there and riding. Truman Capote, you could see him in the upper left. There's a painting by Cece by Dali, and then the scandalous Diego Rivera portrait of her, which is said, I don't know, does it say it there, or did I not include it? Yes, so you can read it yourself, that when she was married, the family didn't think that a nude portrait should be hanging over the bar of their wife, so they apparently got that painting. And then you can see Cece's daughter Cornelia, who would run around Studio 54 with Andy Warhol, does a number of portraits, and those are two of her there. If you hit the next slide. And that house you can actually visit too. It's part of New York Tech. They use it as a catering, New York Institute of Technology. Here we have the William Collins Whitney House, designed by McKim, Mead and White. And actually there's another picture. His picture disappeared too. So technical difficulties, but imagine him in the upper left there, and that's his wife Flora. He would build a very large compound, over 1,000 acres on the North Shore of Long Island, designed by McKim, Mead and White. You can see it below. It had the gymnasium, which I think, John, became the family offices at one point, right?
No, it's a different building.
The gymnasium building on the left, the middle one?
No, but across the driveway is
Yeah.
another building that was the office.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, the gymnasium, that's now part of New York Tech. I think it's their art museum. And then one of the largest private stables in America at the time of William Collins Whitney. And the upper right, if you see that pointy, sort of steep pitched roof building, that's a Warren and Wetmore indoor tennis house. If you saw the movie Trading Places, that's when he goes to ask his friends for money and they start singing. That's actually in that building. Next slide. Their son, Harry Payne Whitney, seen in the upper right, would marry Gertrude Vanderbilt, and you can see their townhouse at 1 West 57th Street, now where Bergdorf Goodman's is, their Newport cottage, the Breakers. And upon William Collins' death, he would leave the property to his son, Harry Payne Whitney. It became known as Whitney Capital, and if you hit the next slide, you're going to learn more about the Whitney property from a direct Whitney. So we have John LeBoutillier. If you want to come down, this is going to be you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great job, Paul. I've been listening very carefully to Mosette and Paul and thinking the whole time, why is it that we are here and fascinated by the Gilded Age, these fabulously rich people and how they spent their money in many ways to great excess, but not always in a degenerate way, because we're here to talk about art in the Gilded Age. And I think no one personifies all of this wrapped together more than Gertrude. Now, so Gertrude was my mother's grandmother. And my mother was her oldest grandchild and grew up and lived with Gertrude for 1 year when she was like 19. So she was an adult woman living with her grandmother. And my grandmother was Gertrude's daughter. So I knew these women very well. And from them, I learned, I think, a lot about Gertrude. And I think they had a lot of Gertrude in them. And I'd like to share a little bit of that. Obviously, this is the studio on the left. We're going to get to that. And Gertrude, as a young lady, sculpting on the right. But Gertrude was born and pretty soon exhibited this desire to create art. So she drew, God bless you. She drew a lot and early on started playing around with sculpting, had some talent for it and a real desire for it. And it became apparent pretty quickly that she was unique in that she was very independent. And her father, who Paul had on an earlier slide, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who built with his brother Grand Central Station and ran the railroads and all, he said to her once that you, more than any other child in this family, have the spirit of your grandfather, the Commodore, who originally made all the Vanderbilt money. And she devoted her life not to making money, but to doing things. She could have just gone to parties and had romances and all, but she was a very motivated, independent spirit with this artistic bent about her. And she was a woman. So imagine being a woman in an era when women were constrained by social convention, but she had something that we didn't have. She was loaded. She was probably the richest woman in America, both from inheritance and then when she married Harry Whitney, another hugely rich family. And this merger of these two families probably made her the richest woman, at least in the United States. And what did she do with that money? It's quite interesting. She built that studio, which I live in today, which is on what was the Whitney property. Let's go, we can start going to the next slide. That's her painted. Well, let's go to the next one. I'm just trying to show what she looked like while I talk about her. So here she is, sculpting obviously on the left, and I love this picture on the right. I'm gonna move over here a little bit, because there she is later in life, sitting, by the way, in pants when women didn't wear pants, but she did. She was avant-garde, as you're gonna see in some more pictures, surrounded by 8 or 9 of her sculptures. And I always look at that one, and I have another one that's not included here, of her, I think, what is in her head when she looks at the things she made? And is she self-critical of them or proud of them or what? I don't know. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's the studio, a nice drawing on the left, a real picture from the garden on the right. Next, please. And same thing. It's a beautiful place. She had a number of studios. She started originally in a studio in Newport, overlooking the cliff walk outside the breakers. Then she acquired a townhouse on 8th Street, and she did a lot of her work there, which is today the Studio School. But in the theme of her independence, she has the studio in New York, she works in there, she works in the one in Newport, and she's married to Harry, and she has 3 children. And she's still juggling all of this. And I'm not sure the marriage was great. I think there was drinking and philandering from Mr. Whitney. And I think she threw herself into her art and built this studio on the Whitney property in Old Westbury that Paul showed you a minute ago. But it was her studio where she went to work 12 hours a day, I think, to get away from all of that. Don't know this for sure, but I sort of picked this up. And the women in this family were very independent. She was independent, her daughter Flora, my grandmother, and shall I tell a funny story about Flora? Why not? So early 80s, 1980s, Flora, my grandmother, is getting on a little bit. A gigantic New York Met fan. Huge baseball fan, huge boxing fan. And she's Gertrude's oldest child. And a fanatical Met fan. So she had 2 gigantic television sets on top of each other with the Met game on.
In
her
the
living
studio.
room. And she's sitting there in her living room. Not in the studio, this is in her house. Yeah. The studio wasn't lived in. So this is in her house, which was Gertrude's house before her. And she's in there watching the Mets when her grandson, my first cousin, Whitney Tower Jr., comes in with 2 scruffy-looking guys. but he knew enough not to interrupt the game. So they sit down in the living room. She's watching the game. She goes, shh, shh, shh. She's got to watch Keith Hernandez and all this. And then the game ends, and she turns the volume down and turns to him, and he says, I'd like to introduce you to my two friends, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. And she looks at these guys and goes, ooh, what do you do? And she never heard of them. And that is Gertrude's daughter, and a very sort of independent person. Then came my mother, who was unbelievably independent, did not inherit any of this artistic stuff, but loved Gertrude. And so her passion later in life was to acquire the studio that she had grown up seeing and turning it into a house to live in. Next slide, please. So there it is on the original over here, and then on the right, with the two wings added on. That's taken from a helicopter, I believe. Next, please. Yeah, and on the left and right, on the right is the master bedroom, and on the left is the kitchen. And my mother wanted to keep the studio the way it was, but make it into a house, so we honor Gertrude. It's as if the spirit of Gertrude is still there, and it's a wonderful place. Now, we'll get back to Gertrude, not just the house and all that, the person. And we can go to the next slide. I have pictures. We were mentioning dogs before, so at the entrance of the studio, who took Latin in school?
Your next slide shows it, a
Okay,
detail.
next, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need a pointer, but can anybody read the right-hand one? Anybody take Latin? C-A-V-E.
Cave.
There we go.
Yes.
I have had more people come for tours of the studio, and the Latin teachers of America have failed miserably. Anyway, so while we're talking about that, now I want to tell you more about Gertrude herself. So Gertrude has this is the living room as it is today, with a portrait over there of her daughter Flora, of future Mick Jagger fame there. And I can tell you another story about Mick. Would you like another story? My aunt, who's still alive, who's 98, Francie Train, 35 years ago, had another relative of ours, cousin, as we called him, cousin Benny Goodman, and other people for a Sunday lunch. And my cousin brings Mick Jagger. So there's Mick Jagger, Benny Goodman, and a bunch of other people sitting around on a Sunday having lunch. And everybody's getting along. And near the end of lunch, Mick says, "Excuse me, but I have to leave now." And he gets up and he goes over to Benny Goodman and he says, Mr. Goodman, I just want to tell you what a great influence your music has had on my career. And he shakes hand and he leaves. And Benny Goodman turns to the table and he says, well, I wish I could have said the same thing. All right, next. Okay, there's Gertrude on the porch of the studio. The porch is exactly the same. And there she is in the 1930s. She died in 1942. Let's keep going. I put these pictures in because she was a clothes horse. I mean, this woman's outfits were beyond belief. And that dog was with her all the time, different dogs, but that dog for a long time. Next, please. Okay, that is a costume made in Paris for her to wear to a ball in, I think, 1912, I think. And it's they took the material from the Ballet Russe and cooked this outfit up, and she wore it, and it was very controversial. And that was Gertrude. She was a trendsetter in many things. Art, which we're going to get to more, clothes, relationships, because I think she had an open relationship with her husband somewhat, and a possibly bisexual relationship, which wasn't talked about a lot, but she would go ahead and do anything. Next, please. So here she is sculpting the Arlington Fountain, of which there were 3 copies. One we had at the studio, one in Montreal at McGill University and one in South America. Next, please. Same thing. So here on the right, that's the other picture I love of Gertrude. So I love the hand, her right hand on the edge of the base of that World War I statue. And again, later in life, looking at her works. And I always wonder, what does she think? And look at her left toe. She's very elegant the way she's posing there. Next, please. Yeah, more of her clothes. Okay, so 1909. By 1909, Gertrude is really sculpting a lot of pieces. She had one on display at the Pan American exhibition in Buffalo. When what event took place? For $50, who knows?
Right.
President McKinley was assassinated. And her piece was on display there. And by the way, who was the vice president when that happened?
Theodore Roosevelt.
And where was he? He was on Mount Marcy in the Adirondacks, and he got word that you've got to come back immediately. And the intertwining of Theodore Roosevelt and Gertrude is amazing when I found out more about it, that Flora, of Mick Jagger fame, ooh, what do you do? Flora became engaged to President Roosevelt's son, Quentin Roosevelt. And it was the love of her life. And Teddy Roosevelt loved my grandmother. Quentin was killed by the Germans. He was shot down and killed in World War I. And that was the beginning of the end of Teddy Roosevelt. He lived 6 more months after that. And he really died in great part of a broken heart over the death of his maybe favorite child, Quentin. And my grandmother loved Quentin. It was the love of her life. And she rebounded and married my grandfather, who had been in the same fighting unit as Quentin, had been at Harvard with him and all that. And that marriage didn't work out. But I'm a product of it, so I'm happy about it. But I mention it because of the war. Now, that was the war to end all wars, which of course it did not do. But it had the biggest effect of all on Gertrude, because her beloved brother, Alfred Vanderbilt, was sunk on the Lusitania, which was torpedoed. And then not long thereafter, the war begins. And Gertrude, who I was talking about her studio in Newport, studio in Old Westbury, studio on West 8th Street, she had a studio in Paris. And every year she went twice to work in the studio in Paris. Early on, she studied under Rodin in Paris. And then she had a working studio there, spoke French, loved Paris, the whole bit. And when the war began, we're not in the war. Europe is in the war, we're not in it. She's over here, August 1914. And she said, I have to do something. And to me, this is the heart of Gertrude. So what am I going to do? So her rich friends say to her, send a check to something. So there was a Red Cross, but she gave it to another thing called the Ambulance Corps. And she gave hundreds of thousands in money then, which would be millions today. And she did that, and then she woke up one day and said, that's not doing it for me. I need to do more. So she goes not far from here, the west side, to Roosevelt Hospital. Undoubtedly, she knew people on the board of directors. And she goes in there and comes out of there, you ready for this? With 12 surgeons and 24 nurses hired that day, paid for by her. They pretty soon go over to the docks on the west side, get on a Cunard ship with her. Off to France they go. They get a bunch of cars when they get there. They drive up to the front with Gertrude in the lead car. The English are there, the Belgians are there, the French are there fighting the Germans, and there's a woman leading this motorcade of people. What are you doing here, ma'am, while I'm here? She finds an abandoned boys' school and acquires it. And these doctors and nurses move in and they convert it into a field hospital. And we're going to get to that in a minute. Can we go ahead for a second?
There's actually pictures of the...
I need the nurse's
Keep
uniform.
going.
Yeah. There is a nurse's uniform. Gertrude creates this field hospital, and she pays for it, she runs it, and she nurses in it, and is forever affected by what she saw, and wrote about it in her diary, about French boys coming in from the battlefield, half blown apart. Their parents are there. Their parents are wondering, where's this guy's brother? He's still fighting, legs being chopped off, the whole thing. And she's nursing these kids and paying for it and writing home to get more doctors to come, and runs the whole thing for a while, and then leaves, and the hospital's running, she leaves, comes back here as America gets into the war. And, okay, can we go ahead? The statue on the right, by the way, that's her. As the war really, with American involvement, gets going, her art changes into figures from the war.
The next one.
Soldiers that are suffering.
If you go one slide down, that's there.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
So here we are with, on the right, trench warfare, soldiers that she patterned on the real soldiers. We'll get to the thing on the left in a minute. So she's done the hospital. Her art has changed. Quentin Roosevelt dies in the war. That affects her. Her brother had died. I mean, this is a devastating, depressing period in Gertrude's life. But the woman was tough. She kept going. And can we go to the next slide, please? She gets a commission from the French government. And they want her to build a statue. So look on the left. That's a sketch that she did after she gets this commission. And they want her to do a statue to be placed in the harbor in Saint-Nazaire, which is on the west coast of France. Now, most of us are seeing every movie about World War II and like the horrible invasion scenes where our guys go onto the beach and get shot to hell by the Germans. World War I was different. What happened there is we arrive on the west coast of France, which is controlled by the French, Germans aren't there, and arrived at Saint-Nazaire and get off the troop carrier ship led by General Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, some of you have heard of him, and march into town. And all the people there love the GIs for coming to help save Europe from Germany. So the war is over. Gertrude's done her hospital thing. She's back doing art in Paris. The world is devastated. And the French commission her. So she does this drawing of what she'd like to do. And then in the middle picture is a mock-up, a maquette. And what she's decided to do is to make an American, what we call a GI. Back then they called him a doughboy. And he wore that uniform with that helmet. And she puts him on an American bald eagle, that's our national bird, holding a sword in his right hand that's been made into the shape of a cross. And so that's the model. And then in 1927, it goes up in the harbor in Saint-Nazaire on the right, that picture. And it's gigantic. Now, I don't have it in here, and it's not related to the Gilded Age, and I know we got to stop. But an addendum to this thing, just to show you. People say Americans hate the French and the French hate Americans. Not true. And that statue went up in 1927. And I have talked to people from Saint-Nazaire who grew up after that, who said that thing was so inspirational to them that an American statue symbolizing the American soldiers who came to save us in World War I would be put up, that the kids would gather near it in the harbor. And in 1940, the Nazis reoccupy France, and on the west coast of France, if you look at a map, it juts out into the Atlantic. And the first thing that happened when the Nazis took over is this guy, Admiral Dönitz, the head of the Navy of Hitler, goes to Hitler. He said, I have to go to Saint-Nazaire and build submarine bases for our U-boats so that our U-boats can start and get out into the Atlantic and interdict and sink American ships going to England and Russia in the Lend-Lease program, right? So they build these unbelievable sub-bases that are still there to this day. We bombed them. The Allies could not destroy these things. And in the process of them building it, Admiral Dönitz sees Gertrude's statue and has it blown up. And it blew it to smithereens. It was lying in bits in the harbor until 1989, when the citizens of Saint-Nazaire put up the money, resurrected it, and put it back up. And I think it's Gertrude, other than Gertrude having 3 children and all that, and having me as a great-grandson, what a great accomplishment. Her greatest accomplishment is that hospital and saving those boys, and in a way being honored by being asked to do this. She did many statues. She did the Titanic Memorial. She did, I have them in here, but we don't have time, Buffalo Bill in Cody, Wyoming. She was a very accomplished sculptress and a promoter of American art and the creator of the Whitney Museum of American Art, all with her money, never asking anybody for anything. It was to do good. And that's why I think when we talk about the Gilded Age, if you have a lot of money, it's one thing. But if you do something good with it, it's a great thing. And let's hope that today's multi-billionaires leave some legacy like that of doing good for others, not just for themselves. Okay.